good evening. Welcome to Spies in My Blood with Alex Storozynski. I'm Amanda Olke, Director of Adult Education here at the International Spy Museum. Thank you so much for joining us. And tonight we are really honored to have Alex with us to discuss his very interesting and very personal book. He will be formally introduced in just a few minutes by Basha Bernhardt, Vice President and Director of the Kosciuszko Foundation Center here in Washington, D.C. But first, my lovely colleague, Maria Wojas-Shalenska, the Cultural Counselor, Communications and Public Diplomacy section at the Embassy of Poland, will make a few remarks. And these have both been wonderful partners for us this evening. Maria?
Thank you, Amanda, for this lovely introduction. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It is a pleasure to be here tonight at the International Spy Museum, a place where history, intrigue, and human stories intersect in unforgettable ways. I want to extend my gratitude to the Spy Museum for hosting this event and for your commitment to sharing the stories of espionage and resistance from around the world, including from Poland. I would also like to thank the Kościuszko Foundation for partnering with the Polish Embassy on this event. I also would like to thank all of you who are joining us tonight, both in person and virtually. It's your curiosity and your desire to explore the often hidden corners of the past that make evenings like this possible and meaningful. Tonight, we come together to celebrate Spies in My Blood, the new book by Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Alex Storozynski. It's a deeply personal story, and yet also a part of a larger national legacy. Because if there is one country whose history is filled with stories of resistance, it is Poland. A nation that has, time and again, been carved up, invaded, occupied, and betrayed, but never silenced. Poland has never surrendered its soul because our people have always resisted, fiercely, bravely, and often at a great cost. These are not just stories of military strategy or intelligence operations. These are stories of moral clarity, sacrifice, and a refusal to accept tyranny, even when the odds seemed impossible. And the story you are about to hear tonight is no different. We hope tonight inspires reflection, conversation, and perhaps a deeper appreciation for the courage that lives not only in fiction, but in real lives. Thank you and enjoy the evening.
All right. Thank you so much, Maria. That was truly meaningful. Over to Basha with a very wonderful introduction of Alex.
Good evening. So, Alex Storozynski says that Kościuszko Foundation's scholarship changed his life. It changed mine too, so I relate to that sentiment. It allowed him to graduate from the Columbia University Graduate School of Journalism, and soon after, in 1985, he traveled to Poland in search for truth about his family. In Poland, he received another scholarship to do his doctoral degree at the Warsaw University. But because he spoke for freedom of speech, the communists declared him an enemy of the state, put an end to the scholarship, and banned him from Poland. What did Alex do? He raised millions of dollars for the Kościuszko Foundation, other scholarships, so other people can receive their doctorates. He also stood up to those who distorted the truth and lie about history and used the term Polish concentration camps. The camps were German and were, of course, built by Germany's Nazis. And thanks to Alex's wonderful book about our patron, the patron of our organization, Tadeusz Kościuszko, The Peasant Prince, the crumbling Revolutionary War fortifications at West Point, designed by Kościuszko, are being rebuilt and turned into a historic trail. Nobel Peace Prize laureate and Poland's national hero, Lech Wałęsa, said, Alex Storozynski has done much for Poland. I ask you to read what he writes and listen to this man. Ladies and gentlemen, knowledgeable, charismatic, colorful, insightful, entertaining chairman of Kościuszko Foundation's Board of Trustees, Alex Storozynski.
Thank you all for coming. So, there's a saying, you can't fool your genes. It's in your blood. Like soldiers who've lost a limb in battle, children of war refugees drag a phantom pain of lost souls, and it lingers until ghosts call upon you. As the first born in my family in the United States, in the Promised Land, Greenpoint, Brooklyn, I was the first natural-born American. My big brother George was born in Argentina. He was 6 years older than me, and he always looked out for me. He heard the call of our ancestors early on. Our family had a history of fighting Russians and communists, and George was proud of our roots. When a kid called him a Polak, George bit the kid's ear off. That ended the Polak jokes. George's dream as a kid was to fly a fighter jet off an aircraft carrier and shoot down Soviet MiGs. George said that my parents didn't want me to go into the family business. My tata, dad in Polish, had other plans for me. Tata was tough, but when he took me to see Mary Poppins and saw the chimney sweeps dancing across the roof, a teardrop rolled around in his eye. And I asked him why. He said, well, before the war, his father, my paternal grandpa, Grzegorz Storozynski, manufactured fireplaces, and he ran a company of chimney sweeps that cleaned them. My parents were born in a mystical area called the Kresy, the borderlands. This region has changed hands over the centuries between Poland, Russia, Austria, and Ukraine. The city that Tata lived in was called Lwow by the Poles, Lviv by the Ukrainians, and Lemberg by the Austrians. In all languages, it means the same thing, the city of lions. In 1939, like today, it was a battleground. Hitler and Stalin attacked Poland at the same time and annexed its territory. They created a new border called the Curzon Line. Tata was an Eagle Scout. He was 17 years old when the war began, and most of the soldiers were fighting Nazi Germany in the West. So he led his Boy Scout troop on a mission to take explosives from the armory, and they blew up a bridge as the Russian army was crossing. Well, the Russians started to look for him. And one night, as he walked up the hill to his house on the edge of Lwow, he saw that the lights were on. And during wartime, at night, it's lights out. A knot tightened in his stomach, and he looked in the window, and he saw that his father had been arrested by Stalin's secret police, the NKVD. So he fled to his uncle's house and was soon ferried between different hiding places, and he was smuggled over the Carpathian Mountains to Romania. This is him in Romania. He met up with Polish soldiers. They were heading west to prepare for the coming German invasion of France. This is Grandpa Grzegorz, my father, and his younger brother, George, Jurek, and Grandpa was put on a freight train to Siberia and never seen again. My mama's city was a town called Równe, which means equal in Polish. The Soviet Union invaded and they renamed it Rivne. When my parents spoke about their childhood, it was as if they were orphans. They spent years unpacking emotional baggage from their childhood, from the Kresy, but they were blocking me from seeing what was in those suitcases. When I was a kid, I came home from school and I gave my mother a hug, and I accidentally put my finger in a hole in her arm, and she flinched. And I said, well, what was that? And she said, oh, that's where the bullet went in. And I said, the bullet? She said, in the camp, I got shot. I said, you were in camp and you got shot at camp? She said, it's not like the camp you go to. This was a Nazi work camp. I said, did the doctors take it out? And she said, no, my older sister Lucy wrapped a schmata around it and it worked its way out after 2 weeks. She was a slave laborer for the German railroad, picking up corpses and scrap metal and dodging bombs from American airplanes. We moved from Greenpoint, Brooklyn to Rockaway Beach, where I used to gather shells on the beach and paint them, and my parents were so happy that I was painting shells, because the shells that they saw as kids had bombs in them. My mother's father, Władysław Krzyżanowski, came to visit us, my dziadek, in Rockaway Beach. And he was a war hero who had escaped from Siberia. One morning, he was shaving, and one of my cousins was arguing with me. And my grandpa cut himself. And he said, you kids, you stop arguing, as a drop of blood dripped down his face. And with shaving cream on the other side, he said, listen, when I was in Siberia, if I found a piece of broken glass, I was excited because it meant I could shave. And he had this flashback in his face that looked as if he was staring down death. This was the moment that I realized my family was different. My parents made money by buying and flipping houses in Rockaway Beach. And then my father got sick. So they bought a motel in upstate New York. My father's war wounds started to take their toll, and he had a heart attack. And when we moved to this motel, my job was to clean the pool and mow the lawn. School was important, but Tata warned us about always standing up for the right thing. He taught us to box, ride horses, and how to survive in the woods. This is my father, who was a motorcycle scout during the Normandy invasion. He taught me how to shoot and clean a rifle, and he said, never be deterred by fear. He said, if you're afraid or if you're in pain, don't let anyone see you cry. And if you're nervous about speaking in public, or if you get shot, dig your thumbnail into your finger so hard that it hurts, and then let go. Give a speech, get shot. What was he getting me ready for? Well, while we had the motel, George was at college at NYU, and he was driving a taxi in Manhattan to make money. He'd show up with these used sports cars that he would work on. George was always up to something sneaky. He was a master of trickery. And my father, Tata, would give him the stink eye and mix up those two words together and say, don't be sneakery. Snickety. Well, whenever Tata told me about the chimney sweep company, my mother would run over and say in Polish, nie, zolusze mnie. With Alex, no, you already have one. And I thought, you already have one? What does that mean? I wasn't sure, but it had something to do with my older brother. And my brother George here always listened in on my father's conversations with the war veterans. He was always eavesdropping, and he knew these stories. Well, before he died, my father confessed to me that these chimney sweeps were actually aspiring in Lviv in the 1930s. They kept track of the Russians that were coming into Lviv. The city of Lions was the front line with the Soviet Union. Stalin's troops stole grain from Hungarian farmers, and they killed millions in an engineered famine called the Holodomor. The Russians were expanding into Poland. My grandfather's company would sweep and they would snoop. This is Tata's big brother, Włodzimierz, who was one of the chimney sweep spies. Tata revealed all of this to me right before he died. He died when we were running the motel. My brother came to that motel with a beautiful new girlfriend named Anna. Her father was the captain of the Polish liner, the Stefan Batory. My brother was excited about this beautiful girlfriend, but he was more excited that her father was the captain of this Stefan Batory. George was after connections for smuggling cargo in and out of Poland. Mama sold a motel and we moved back to Rockaway Beach. And there she met a man named Jack Eisner, a Holocaust survivor, who founded a company called Stafford Industries. And he said he has this company that's importing textiles from Poland and Eastern Europe into the United States. But he has a son who doesn't speak Polish. And my mother said, I have a son who speaks Polish. And he just graduated from NYU with a degree in business. So Eisner hired George to go run his office in Warsaw for Stafford Industries. But then the Solidarity strike started, and so the business had to close. And George moved back to the United States. And when he moved back to the United States, he started looking for a job. And one day I get a phone call from a friend in upstate New York saying, there were men here today asking about your brother. They were asking questions. And I said, what kind of questions? And they said, well, is he a good son? Is he a loyal American? Does he like girls? Is he gay? Does he do drugs? And my friend said, my father said they were from the CIA. And I asked George about this, and he said, nah, I went and applied for a job at the CIA, but they didn't want me. People in the CIA don't make money. Bankers make money. So George became head of the newly founded Polish and Slavic Federal Credit Union in Brooklyn. He helped Polish exiles who deposited their earnings and build their credit rating in the United States. George modernized this fledgling organization. He installed a computerized banking system, and he grew the bank's assets from 20 million to 100 million in 2 years. The CIA was smuggling money in and out of Poland to Solidarity so that they could overthrow communism. And George's proximity to cash going in and out of Poland caught the eye of businessmen, communist diplomats, and the FBI. Well, in 1985, I wanted to be a journalist, so I applied to the Columbia University Graduate School of Journalism, but I couldn't afford it. The Kościuszko Foundation gave me a scholarship. And after I graduated from Columbia, I decided that I'm going to set out to Poland now to find my roots. It had different borders during the Cold War, much different borders than when my family had to flee from the Russians. So I crossed the Berlin Wall in search of adventure behind the Iron Curtain. When I arrived in Warsaw, Poland was under Russian occupation. Communism was harsh. I quickly learned the value of the dollar exchanged on the black market for currency, and suddenly I was kind of well off. But even with money, I couldn't buy anything because the communist economy was a total scam and there was nothing in the stores. And even if there was something, you needed ration cards for flour, sugar, alcohol, anything. And toilet paper, it was easier to buy Russian caviar than it was to buy toilet paper. And even if you could find it, it wasn't real bathroom tissue. It was this recycled mush. Sometimes it had wood pulp and even splinters in it. I watched how Poles navigated through this system forced upon them by the Soviet Union. This taught me how to finagle, to wheel and deal, to get what you want. So I put that skill into getting a scholarship. Journalists are taught to be aggressive, so I convinced the higher education ministry to give me a doctoral fellowship to write about free speech at the University of Warsaw. And my brother's friends arranged for me to meet the most hated man in Poland, Jerzy Urban, the propaganda minister of the Polish People's Republic. I started attending his press conferences with foreign correspondents. I was hired by newspapers to translate interviews with Solidarity leader Lech Wałęsa and other opposition movement people that were trying to overturn communism. I started hanging out with Polish rock stars. I became close friends with singer-songwriter Stanisław Sojka, who just unfortunately passed away 2 weeks ago. I went on tour with Man Am and their lead singer Cora, who was kind of like the Madonna of Poland in the 80s. I went on tour with them, and I was chauffeured through the Tatra Mountains in a Mercedes-Benz, smoking pot with Cora. She let me on stage to take these pictures. And just as I was starting to have fun, I was put under surveillance. The scholarship that I received included a room in the dormitory, but it was disgusting. There was no toilet paper or even toilet seats. So I rented a one-bedroom apartment near the university. And I registered in the dorm, because you had to be registered somewhere. And I told my friend Mariusz, I'm going to register in the room with you, and you'll have the room to yourself. And he said, okay, but you should leave some clothes here in case they show up looking for you. And I said, they? He goes, you know, them. I said, what do you mean, them? He said, you know them if they come looking for you. I said, what do you mean, them? He said, you know, them, the Służba Bezpieczeństwa, the secret police. And I said, how do you know it's them? He said, everybody knows it's them. So when the police found out that I had this apartment, they snuck into my apartment and they stole my visa. And now I'm in the country illegally. So I was summoned for an interrogation to the police station and interrogated by an SB agent named Karol Świerad. Świerad said, if you collaborate with the secret police, we can give you money, we can give you a car, we can give you women. What is it that you need? I was terrified. I refused. I said, no, I'm not going to collaborate. And so I went to the American embassy and reported this. It was clear that they were trying to entrap me. So I went in and I spoke to the consul, and before I started telling the whole story, he said, stop, don't tell me the story. There's a listening device in that building across the street aimed at this room, and they could probably hear everything you say. I said, good, I want them to hear this. They made me an offer to collaborate, and I'm refusing to do it. And I'm here to tell you about it. And he said, well, we sure hope you're not going to take their offer. And I said, if I was going to take their offer, would I come here to tell you about it? He said, no, I guess not. But you know what you could do? You could talk to our people to see what they have to offer. Then I got really scared. I said, you know, there's another option here. I'm not going to take their offer. I don't even want to talk to our people. I'm going to continue what I'm doing, working on this doctorate. But if I disappear, this guy named Karol Świerad in this office is the guy who's been interrogating me. He said, okay. But let me warn you, they're going to call you and they're going to tell you that they found your visa. And they're going to meet with you in a public place and give you an envelope. And they're going to take pictures of you taking that envelope, and they're going to use that picture to blackmail you. And I said, okay, thanks. Well, sure enough, 2 days later, I get a phone call from Karol Świerad, and he says, "We found your visa. We're going to meet with you at the statue of Bolesław Prus to give it back to you in a public place." And I said to my friend Mariusz, "You know, you're right, they came looking for me." And I said, "Where is the statue of Bolesław Prus?" And he said, "Well, it's across the street from the building with no corners." And I said, "So you think they're going to try and take a picture of me from behind one of those columns?" "Nah, they're not going to do that." I said, "Why not?" "They'll get a much better view from the apartments above. That's where all the secret police and officers live." I thought, wow, the secret police, they're snickery. The Kremlin's mouthpiece in the Soviet Union was a man named Leonid Toporkov. He was the correspondent from the Russian newspaper Izvestia. The year before I arrived, he wrote an article calling Father Jerzy Popiełuszko a threat to national security. Jerzy Urban followed up with an article also attacking Popiełuszko, saying that his masses were hate rallies. The SB secret police took this as a signal that it was okay to silence the priest, and they murdered him. So I began writing this doctorate about the function of the press spokesman for the Polish People's Republic. And Jerzy Urban told me that he knew how to manipulate the American media. Well, Chernobyl happened, and this is the press conference where the Poles are talking about Chernobyl. They took this photograph. And they kept asking him, when did the Kremlin inform Poland about the accident and that radiation clouds are headed your way? Well, the truth was the Russians never told them. Urban had to change the subject. And during the May Day parade in 1987, the communist dictator General Jaruzelski waved at the crowd as a radiation cloud floated over the whole people going by. Well, what did Urban do? He changed the subject. He changed the subject by saying that there was a Polish officer who defected to the West. And he leaked the story about the defection of Colonel Ryszard Kuklinski. He leaked it to the Washington Post. And the Washington Post wrote an article saying that Kuklinski knew about martial law to crush Solidarity, but he didn't tell Solidarity. So he's a bad guy. Well, that wasn't the truth. The truth was that Kuklinski leaked thousands upon thousands of documents from the Soviet Union about their first strike plans for a nuclear war against the West. It was pure propaganda. Urban was making this guy out to be this bad guy when he was actually a hero who stopped World War III. And there was a secret mission, and Kuklinski was exfiltrated from behind the Iron Curtain. Senator Ted Kennedy came to Poland to give the Robert F. Kennedy Human Rights Award to the parents of Father Jerzy Popiełuszko. And a correspondent from the Boston Globe came and hired me as his fixer. And around this time, I started getting noticed a little bit by the Western press, and I wrote a piece for the Wall Street Journal's European edition about a movie called Blind Chance. It was by a famous Polish director named Krzysztof Kieślowski. And it was about a man who runs for a train, and he has 3 different storylines. The movie starts over 3 times. In one, he becomes pro-communist. In the other, he becomes anti-communist. And in the third, he is neutral and doesn't take sides. And in all 3 storylines, that character ends up at the Warsaw airport. And in the first one, they don't let the guy on because he refuses to collaborate with the communists. In the second one, they say, you've got to go and put down these anti-communist strikes. And in the third one, where the guy was neutral, he actually gets on the plane. Well, he gets on the plane, it takes off, and it explodes over the woods, the Kabaty woods right outside of Warsaw. And I ask Kieślowski, so what does that mean? It means that if you're neutral, No, he says. That plane waits for us all. It's somewhere. It's waiting for you, it's waiting for me, but somewhere it's always waiting. A month after the Wall Street Journal ran this piece, in real life, a plane takes off from the airport in Warsaw and blows up over the Kabata forest. It was ominous. It was as if Kieślowski had a premonition. When Pope John Paul II came to Poland, I applied for press credentials. And I was again interrogated by the secret police, Karol Świerad. He said I would only get a press pass if I spied on the other correspondents, American correspondents in Warsaw. The more I learned about the methods of the secret police and of Jerzy Urban and how they were manipulating the press, the more I spoke up for freedom of speech, the more they tried to blackmail me. So I headed to New York to go home to try and start my journalism career. And as I'm traveling through Berlin, there are these German hipsters in the cafe where I am, and they're talking about, oh, the historic event, the wall, Gorby, Gorby. And I say, yeah, that's an incredible speech that Mr. Reagan gave. And they said, Mr. Reagan, what are you talking about? We're talking about David Bowie. A week before Reagan's speech, David Bowie had a concert at the Wall. And Bowie yelled as he sang his song, Heroes, We Can Be Heroes, standing by the wall. That song is about the Berlin Wall. And before he started that song, he said, we send our best wishes to all our friends on the other side of the wall. And as he sang Heroes, the East Germans rushed to the wall and they said, Gorby, Gorby, let us out. The Stasi beat people and the Germans arrested them. And the Germans were more excited about Bowie's concert than they were about Reagan's speech. Well, when I got home, I looked through my drawer for my grandfather's World War II medals. He won all these medals in World War II, and when he died, he left them to me. And he also left me that cutthroat razor he used to shave with. But I looked in the bag and it was gone, and my mama said, I threw it out. And then she gave me my father's fountain pen instead. And she said, in your line of business, you're gonna be using this instead of a cutthroat razor. I never used a pen like this before, so I started putting the cartridge in and I jabbed my hand and I cut myself and a drop of blood went on and ink went everywhere. My mother started to laugh. I said, why are you laughing? And she said, the mess from that cutthroat razor would have been much worse. Now George is back in New York and he got his pilot's license and he used to take me flying. And there's that phrase that you hear all the time, balls to the wall. What that phrase refers to is when a pilot's taking off, he thrusts the throttle up to the wall and yells balls to the wall. And we flew over Long Island, we flew over the Hudson River, we passed the World Trade Center so high that we could see the people inside working. And after the Berlin Wall collapsed, George became an investment banker and he moved back to Warsaw and started working on transforming Poland's economy to capitalism. And after a couple of years, he invites me and says, come back to Poland, come visit me. So before I go, my mama says, watch out for your brother's friends. I said, what do you mean, watch out for my brother's friends? I'm going to see my friends, So one night after hanging out with my Polish rock star friends, I come back to my brother's apartment and I open the door and I hear two men arguing with drunken voices in the kitchen. And I hear my brother laughing, ha! What a great spy you were. You stole the formula for laundry detergent from the West And thanks to you, Poland had Ixi powder to make their delicate fabrics and shirts whiter than white. And the other voice says, that's not true, I'm gonna punch you in the face. And all of a sudden he says, wait, someone's walking in. And my brother says, don't worry, it's only my brother Alex. And I walk in, and the man standing there was Sławomir Petelicki, the commander of GRUM, Poland's Special Forces. Petelicki gave me a firm handshake, and I noticed that he had a knife strapped under his pant leg. And when he left, I told my brother about the knife. And he said, well, you know, Petelicki was trained by the Delta Force, but during the communist era, he was actually a spy for the communists. But now he's an ally of the Americans. Another night, my brother invites me to meet another one of his friends. And he introduces me to this man, Gromysław Czempiński. Gromysław Czempiński was a Polish spy, but at the start of the First Gulf War, Czempiński exfiltrated 6 CIA agents out of Baghdad. And President George Herbert Walker Bush forgave half of Poland's debts to the United States as payback for this favor. Czempiński later became the head of Poland's new state protection office, WWII, who was the successor to the SB. Yes, Mama was right. George's friends were snickery. George and Czempiński were both pilots who rented planes at the Warsaw Aero Club, and they dreamt of being military pilots when they were kids. The difference is that while George would have been flying off of US aircraft carriers, Czempiński wanted to fly Soviet MiGs. Had they met in the sky back then, during the Cold War, they would have been shooting at each other. Well, when I got back to New York, George was flying one of these small planes, and he had a plane crash near Warsaw. An aircraft that he was piloting hit some trees as he was taking off, and it crashed, and he broke a bunch of bones. He was flown back to New York for surgery to fuse his vertebrae back together. A year later, he developed bone marrow cancer in those injuries. And the cancer really started to eat away at him. So another plane crash. Wow, Kieślowski's plane crashes are getting more frequent. And then more planes crash, this time into the World Trade Center. And some of my friends in Rockaway Beach were firefighters and died in the rescue effort. Many people don't remember this, but a month after the World Trade Center attacks, another plane crashed in New York. This was Flight 587 taking off from Kennedy Airport, and one of its engines landed on the house that I grew up in. This is the house where Grandpa Jadek was shaving with that cutthroat razor. And I thought, my God, that plane waits for us all. And it keeps getting closer and closer. Well, George's obsession with planes haunted me. Here you see a scar on his face after the plane crash, and he had a bone marrow transplant. He started to recuperate. And one day he comes to my house, and while visiting me, he pulls out pictures of him on the deck of the USS Harry Truman being flown, being catapulted off in an F-18 with a US Navy pilot. And then he shows me another picture of him in the captain's chair that says VIP on it. And he pulls out a hat that says USS Harry Truman, and it says George Storozynski on the back. And I said, this is not something normal people get to do. How did you? He said, well, I did a couple of favors for some people, and this was payback. Well, George's cancer came back, and he could no longer make bone marrow, and I was giving him my platelets and my blood, and his body started to reject them. His friend Petelicki knew he was going to die, and he came to say goodbye. General Czempiński also came by to say goodbye. And one day I bought George's favorite soup, wonton soup. And we're eating this wonton soup. And the blood that I had donated given to him is dripping out of his nose and into the soup. And George took a spoon and picked up that blood, my blood, out of his nose and started slurping it up. He wanted to gross me out. That's what big brothers do. Well, I had to pretend that it didn't faze me, because if I did, it would have made it worse. So after eating the soup, I rented a movie called Spy Game with Robert Redford and Brad Pitt. And after the movie, George sits up and says, well, that was realistic. And I said, what do you mean? He said, about life in the CIA. And I said, how would you know? And he said, how do you think Kuklinski got out of Poland? I drove him. And I said, what? And he said, yeah, in November 1981, there was a banquet at the Soviet embassy in Warsaw to commemorate the Russian Revolution. And the CIA dressed him up in a Polish uniform and put him in a black Volga like Kuklinski's car. And George pulled up to the Soviet embassy, picked up Kuklinski, and drove him to a CIA safe house in Warsaw. George then faded back into the scenes, and Kuklinski was flown out of Poland. And as I started asking more questions about this, George got nervous and said, don't write about me. Don't write about our father and our grandfathers, what they did. I never got to see Lviv, he said, but at least I got to see Moscow. And rumbling through his papers after he died, I found this picture of him in Red Square, and I thought, Moscow? When was he in Moscow? So I started filing Freedom of Information Act requests with the CIA, and there was a book about Kuklinski that was coming out. So I went and I met with the author, and I told him my brother's story. And the author said, no, Kuklinski was put into a big box, along with his wife and his two sons, and they were driven across Poland, across East Germany, and through the Soviet checkpoint at Checkpoint Charlie, in a big box. And I said, the CIA wants Kuklinski. Of course they want his sons and wife to get out too. But do you really think that they would put him in a box and drive him across the most guarded border in the world? And this reporter said, yes. And I said, it's clear that the CIA wants the real story kept secret. Could it be possible that the CIA was being snickery? Well, I reached out to Zbigniew Brzezinski and I said, look, I need to talk to Kuklinski. When I was at my desk at the New York Daily News where I worked, Kuklinski called me and he verified George's version of the escape. And he said, listen, I can't tell you where I am, but I'm going to come to New York. And I will call you, and we'll meet for coffee. You carry a picture of your brother, not what he looked like now when he died, what he looked like in 1981 when he did that mission. And I will tell you if this is the guy who drove me out. 2 months go by, Kuklinski died, and I never got to meet him. A few years later, I was in Warsaw, and I met Kuklinski's confidant, Joseph Szaniawski, who was opening a museum about the Cold War spy in Warsaw. Szaniawski also confirmed my brother's story. When I told him this, he said, oh, how do you know this? 3 people in the world know this. And I said, well, my brother told me. And he said, yes, it's true. And he showed me secret maps that the Soviet Union was planning to attack Western Europe during the Cold War. Well, I was digging through my brother's things. I was digging through my father's things. And George said, write about Tata, don't write about me. So I started going through my father's papers. My father told me when I was little that he had killed Russians and Germans during the war, sometimes in hand-to-hand combat, sometimes with a knife. And when I went through his military archives from the military in Great Britain, because they fought alongside the British, I found that he'd actually downplayed his service, what he really did. And I was digging through this suitcase with letters and photographs and documents and microfilm with details of the battles that he fought in during World War II. And I found this photo. In 1939, when he was an Eagle Scout in Lviv, he blew up that bridge that I told you about. And on the back of this photo from the second day of the war, it says these are his closest friends, Oleg and Yurek. They're the diminutives of Alex and George. This is who Tata named us after. And he was in Normandy, and then later, during the Dunkirk evacuation, the Poles got evacuated to Scotland, and my father's pictures are first he's in a uniform, then suddenly he's in kilts, and then suddenly he's wearing a nice suit, and rather than sleeping in a tent, he has his own apartment. And the quartermaster put this Leica camera enlarger in his room. He wanted to be one of the Cichocemne spies who were dropped into Poland behind enemy lines during World War II. But he was only a corporal. So they said, you're going to make the microfilm that's going to go in the belts and the boots of these guys. So my father worked for the quartermaster, Q, like in the James Bond movies. And here's my father. When the Normandy invasion came out, this is General Maczek, Montgomery. This is my father right here. His unit was inspected by Eisenhower, Patton, many others. Here's Eisenhower, who came and impressed the Poles during target practice. And here's my father during the Normandy campaign. It was a town called Abbeville. The Canadians said that they had taken the town. So this is my father with the helmet on facing, and his officer sent him to Abbeville and said, go find out if the Canadians took that town. And my father came back and said, no, it's a trap. The Germans are setting an ambush for us. We can't go into Abbeville. The Poles fought their way up through Belgium, through Netherlands. When they made it to Germany, the Nazis surrendered. So my father was recalled, and with his experience making a microfilm for Q and scouting out Nazi positions in Normandy, they put him to work for the Polish Ministry of Interior in London, trying to keep the Russians out of Poland. But unfortunately, they lost that battle. My maternal grandpa, Jadek, the guy who was shaving with that cutthroat razor, had escaped from Siberia, and he joined the Polish Second Army, and he crossed Iran, Iraq. He reached Palestine as part of the Polish Second Corps. They fought their way across North Africa, and here is my grandpa in the middle at the walls of Jerusalem, and here is my grandpa all the way on the end there in front of the pyramids. And he trained as a tank commander. And when you're a tank commander, you get to name your tank. So Grandpa named his tank Zagłoba. Zagłoba is a Henry Sienkiewicz character with a quest for glory. But while Zagłoba's tales of gallantry on the battlefield were all made up, Jadek got enemy's blood on his hands, and he shed some of his own. He fought up the coast of Italy. He fought at the Battle of Monte Cassino. He won these medals. And when the Germans gave up, he found out that his daughters were still alive. Jadek had no idea of the horrors that my mother and her sisters and my grandma, his wife, went through. My mother was sent at one point to live in a town. This is my mother with her little sister. At one point, she was sent to live in a town called Mizoch. And one day, the Germans marched into Mizoch, and they took out all the Jews, and they made them take off all their clothes, and they shot them to death on the edge of a ravine. And the Germans actually took these pictures to document this. Well, my mother fled from Mizoch, and she made it to a town called Janova Dolina, where a band of Ukrainians were murdering Polish Catholics with axes and farming tools, and they set their homes on fire. 100,000 Poles were killed in what became known as the Lwow massacre. Well, my mother escaped the Lwow massacre, and when she was running away from these people that were trying to kill her, the only way she could hide was she went into the feces of an outhouse and covered herself with leaves. And after the killers left, she reunited with her mother, and there she was put on a rail car into Nazi Germany. She was imprisoned and forced to work as a slave laborer for the German railroad. Her job was to pick up corpses and scrap metal. Her sister was killed during a bombing raid, Natalia. She was collateral damage. And my mother said the word collateral damage has to be cursed by all nations. She survived the camp and was telling me the story towards the end of her life. And she told me what happened and how she escaped. And one day she pulls out this picture. This is my mother, and that's her sister Lucy. I had an older cousin named Robert who was 16 years older than me. And she said, this man here is Robert's biological father. It's not Uncle Richard. I said, why are you telling me this? And she said, well, because at some point after I'm gone, if Robert ever says to you that he knows this and he wishes who his real father was, show it to him. But if you think it would cause him pain, keep it a secret. Well, after my mother died, years go by, and then Uncle Richard dies. So I call up Cousin Robert and I say, my condolences. And he says, no, that's all right. Turns out Uncle Richard wasn't my real father. Boy, I wish I knew who my real father was. This was the moment that Mama had seen coming. So I said, well, I have a picture of him. Would you like to see him? He said, yeah. So we start talking about our mothers who are dead. We start talking about grandfather. And I said, boy, one time Grandpa was shaving with this cutthroat razor, and he cut himself and he was bleeding. And he told me about Siberia. And Uncle Robert says, you know what he used to do with that cutthroat razor, don't you? And I said, shave? He goes, not only. He said, when the Germans invaded Poland and France and Italy and all these countries, they would always kidnap the most beautiful women in that town, and they would put them in a house and create a bordello. And the Nazi officers would go in and they would rape those women. When Grandpa was in Italy and he found out about this, the night before battles, he would sneak into those bordellos and assassinate German officers as they were raping these women. Well, after the war, the British switched their loyalty from the Polish government in exile and all these Polish soldiers that had fought alongside of them. And the British recognized Stalin's government. And the Americans recognized Stalin's government. And so now this passport that my father had with the crown on the eagle is for a passport, is for a country that doesn't exist. So this passport had no stamps in it. He wasn't allowed to travel on it. So he decided he was going to leave. He sailed for Argentina. And when he arrived in Argentina, he met my mother and he met Jadek, and they exchanged their stories about the war. And I found this picture actually of my father in a history book. This is him in the Normandy campaign. He would ride ahead of the officers and tell them where the Germans were hiding. And I went to a lecture at the Polish Veterans House in New York City and started asking questions of a historian that worked for the Polish Communist Archives. And this historian was named Sławomir Cęckiewicz. And he had access to all of these communist archives. And I told him, I said, in the 80s, I was interrogated by the secret police, and then they offered me money and women and cars. And he said, you definitely collaborated. I said, I didn't collaborate, I'm telling you. I just wonder if they wrote anything about me in these archives. He said, I'm going to go back and I'm going to look it up. And if you were a collaborator, I'm going to tell the whole world about it and let them know. Well, a couple of weeks later, I get an email from him, and he says, I apologize. You didn't collaborate. You stood up to them. They hated your guts because they worked hard to get you. They took surveillance photos of you, and they called you Rocky because they thought you were tough. I said, wow. And there's surveillance photos of your brother, and they called him Nemo. And then he shares these communist-era documents with me, and it turns out that I was banned from Poland and declared an enemy of the state. And the man who declared me an enemy of the state was none other than my brother's friend, Lwow Czempiński. Well, when I became president of the Kościuszko Foundation, I started getting more and more of these documents and getting more access. And I told them what I was looking for, that I was interrogated by a guy named Karol Świerad. And they sent me a document, and they said, look closely at one of these dossiers named Konrad Dubelski. And as soon as I saw this photograph, I realized that's Karol Świerad. That's the man who interrogated me. I recognized those beady eyes and that mustache, and suddenly I got his dossier too. And it turned out that 2 months after I was kicked out of Poland and banned from Poland, Dubelski's brother-in-law defected to West Germany. And Dubelski was fired from the secret police by none other than my brother's friend, Lwow Czempiński. So, as my brother said, he never got to go to Lviv, but I did. And this is Lviv, which is today Lviv. That's the opera house in Lviv. And I went to search for the spot where my father's house used to be. And I had an older uncle who told me that, don't go, because the Russians blew it up. It was at the end of a street called Green Street, across from where there's a soccer stadium. And I went to the end of Green Street, and I found a red brick house just like my father had described, and I found some rubble over here, and I'm walking around that house, and an old Ukrainian man walks out of the house and says, what are you looking for? And I said, well, my father lived here before the war, but he had to flee, and supposedly the Russians blew up his house. And he says, it's true. He said, when I arrived here at the end of World War II, there was a pile of bricks there. They made us build a brick kiln out of that house. We don't know what those people did, but the Russians hated them. And out of that brick kiln, we had to make cinder blocks and bricks to build that soccer stadium. I was in shock. It was this, like, I was led to this spot where this man told me what happened to my father's house. So I pulled out some money. I said, listen, mister, I don't know what you like to drink, beer or vodka, but here, buy yourself a drink on me. He said, no, he pushed it away. He said, I didn't tell you this because I want something from you. I told you this because you have a right to know what happened to your father's house. So I said, thank you. I started walking around the soccer stadium, and lo and behold, I come upon a brick kiln made from the bricks of my father's house that was blown up by the Russians. Well, one of those bricks was loose, and I pulled it out, and I took it home with me. And as I was writing this book, I would look at that brick and think, if only that brick kiln could talk. If only this brick could tell me what it had seen. If only my father and grandfathers could tell me more about their secret missions fighting the Nazis and the communists. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Alex. And I want to invite anybody who has questions, please come over here to the microphone. And I don't mean to hog it. I will look online. We just have one comment here from a viewer, just thanking you for all these incredible illustrations. And what was the history book that you saw your father's image in?
It was this Polish book about Maciek's army, their campaign fighting in Western Europe. And that's where I found it.
Are you coming this way? Awesome.
Dobry wieczór.
Dobry wieczór.
I'm just curious. Can you hear me okay?
I can.
Okay. I'm just curious, how long did it take you to write this book?
My entire life. No, truthfully. I mean, the parts of the book that are about Jerzy Urban and life in the 80s and explaining what life under communism was like was something that I wrote in the 80s. And I started pitching it as a book to American publishers back then. And they said, we don't believe that this is what life is like under communism. This is terrible. You're making this stuff up. And I said, no, this is real. Oh, you're just making fun of Poles. And I said, I'm not making fun of Poles. I'm making fun of communists. This is real stuff. And so then I sort of put that aside and focused on, my journalism career and writing about Kościuszko. And then every time one of my ancestors would die, first my father, and then my grandfather, and then my mother. When they were dying, I was always asking them questions, but when they were dying, they really wanted to open up and tell me what happened. So it came in waves as they were dying, and then I would go look up what they told me in archives, and what they told me was true.
Dziękuję.
Proszę bardzo.
All right, we have some other online questions. One woman says, as you reflect upon your mom saying, you already have one, what do you think she knew? Did she give you any other hints about what she knew?
She knew when my brother died, I sent a Freedom of Information Act request to the CIA. Much of it was blocked out, but it was his application, and it talked about, his language skills, perfect Polish and Russian, and then there was a contact person on that application that was from the early 80s, and that contact person was my mother, and there was her signature, which I recognized. And I was like, oh, she knew. She knew that's what she was talking about.
All right, we have a really lovely question that I think will be a great one to wrap up with. What would your advice be to young Polish Americans who want to continue to learn and be part of their ancestry?
Well, first, approach whatever relatives you have that are still alive and ask them as many questions as you can. And if they went through some sort of horror, a lot of times they don't want to talk. But if you tell them, well, this is what I heard, and this is what I know, usually those older relatives will say, nah, that's not how it was. Let me tell you how it was. And they will tell you how it was. And just keep digging, keep reading, in Polish, reach out to the archives. If you have people that had military backgrounds, look at the Sikorsky Institute in London, which has military records. Look at the IPN in Warsaw, which has records.
Wonderful. And to even it out, one more in-person question.
Good evening, dobry wieczór.
Dobry wieczór.
Aleksie, dziękuję. Fantastyczny wykład. My students are always saying that your research is impeccable. It's fantastic. But for your first book, it was less personal. So this time you are researching again. Can you tell us in what ways this kind of research was different for you? And was it because it's more personal? Did you find this more difficult or easier?
Absolutely more difficult. It was very painful, you know, when my mother told me stories about, you know, the Lwow massacre. When she told me, you know, about the massacre of Mizoch, and she told me about her good friend Monica, a Jewish girl who was killed, and she said that they were marched out of town, and a month later, the Germans came and said, all right, there's clothes and stuff in this barn outside of town. If any of you want to go see if there's anything there. So the Poles, you know, went and they looked in this barn, and my mother found her friend Monica's dress in that barn. And she picked it up and she smelled it and she said, oh my God, it smells like Monica. And she took that dress back to her aunt's house and slept with that dress under her pillow because she thought, Monica's going to come back and I will be able to give her back her dress. And so as my mother is telling me the story about the massacre of Mizoch, I went online and did a search about the massacre of Mizoch. And I found that photograph of these Jewish women and children murdered by the Germans, and I showed it to her, and her face dropped. And she said, oh my God, and she's looking to see if she recognizes her friend Monica among those dead bodies. And I thought, my God, what did I do? Why did I show her this photograph? What pain I just put upon her. So when I started finding photographs of the Mizoch massacre, I didn't make the same mistake. I didn't show her those photos. Those photos were just as brutal. I couldn't show, they were too brutal to even show tonight. That's just one example of how painful it was for me.
Thank you.
Alex, I want to thank you for a really riveting journey. I feel like we went with you, and there was joy and laughter and horror as well. Alex's book is for sale. If you are here in the theater and you would like to buy a book or have Alex sign it, we'll be doing that right outside. And if you're with us online, it is available in our online retail store. So thank you so much. I want to thank our partners, the Kościuszko Foundation, the Embassy of Poland. We love working with both organizations, both entities, and this was a very special evening. Thank you, everyone, for being here.